Geography 130, Lecture 16. Yes, I apologize. There are 98 slides in today's lecture. Chances are slim that we'll get through all of them, but we'll do what we can. This is a result of the fact that in previous years I've spent more than 1 week teaching Dust Bowl. I've also spent more than 1 week teaching First the Seed, which is Jack Kloppenberg's book from which I'm asking you to read for Thursday. And as a result, I have too many lectures to try to compress into the available lectures in the syllabus. But again, we're going to do what we can. Both books are very much focused on American agriculture and food production in the 20th century, the history of American agriculture. They're also both very much focused on the role of the federal government, the state, in agriculture, and how we came to have the relationship that we have in this country between the federal government and agricultural production. The two books kind of fit together in that sense. Donald Worster's book is an environmental history. Donald Worster, in some respects, might be said to be responsible for the resurgence of environmental history in the last 25 years or so. He is a grand old figure in environmental history. Dust Bowl is one of his earliest books, and I believe one of his best books. I hope that you enjoyed reading the first half of it. I would encourage you to feel free to read the rest of it if you have the time and interest. Today I want to talk about Worster's book, try to condense what I have to say about it into a single lecture. We're going to start, however, with a brief discussion of sustainability, a term that has come up in the class already, but which I've not attempted to define or address directly. I want to look at the sort of prevailing definition of sustainability, offer an alternative formulation of it in terms of patterns, processes, and thresholds in both ecological and social economic systems. I want to look specifically at Worster's explanation for the Dust Bowl and why it happened, which relies very heavily on culture. I will draw from the rest of the book, in addition to the portion that I asked you to read, although obviously for purposes of the class, the emphasis as far as what you need to know will fall on the first half. This will turn finally into questions of capitalist agriculture and the state, which will be a theme that will then reappear quite strongly in Kloppenberg's reading for Thursday. So, are there any questions before we get started? All right, good. So, what's this? Somebody said it. It's a prairie dog. Why do we care about prairie dogs? Yes? All right, they survived the Dust Bowl. They were a major presence in that part of the country. They are still there to some degree now, but much reduced from their earlier range. These are black-tailed prairie dogs. You'll see that their historic range extends through the Great Plains, the short grass and some degree mid-grass prairie of the plains. There are other subspecies of prairie dogs found more in the Great Basin. There are also some in Mexico. We're going to be concerned primarily with those in this area, which defines in many ways the higher and drier portion of the Great Plains. This map shows you that they are now much reduced in their numbers, although their distribution is still quite wide. This shows areas where there are still viable populations, areas of more than 5,000 acres. The green ones are federal land, the yellow ones are tribal land, the blue is state lands. The prairie dog is now actually under consideration for listing as an endangered species, even though there are still several hundred thousand of them found in the wild, but their numbers have been so dramatically reduced that they are a candidate for listing under the ESA. They have been reduced in number largely due to the efforts of the U.S. government, which for most of the 20th century underwrote an extremely aggressive campaign of eradication. This has turned around somewhat because of that creature. Anybody know what that is? That is a listed endangered species. That is the black-footed ferret. The black-footed ferret is not nearly as numerous as never was as numerous as the prairie dog. It lives primarily by eating prairie dogs, and with the rapid, dramatic decline in prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets have in fact become endangered and very nearly went extinct. But a few were found, and they're now in the process of being reintroduced in a number of places. Their long-term survival really does depend on the reestablishment of a more viable population of black-tailed prairie dogs. So, I bring this up partly because it has a major role in some of the research I do, so I take an interest in prairie dogs. But let's see how this relates to these questions. These are photographs, famous photographs of the Dust Bowl. I imagine most of you had heard of the Dust Bowl before. Were you familiar with its details as you read them in Worster's book? This is widely considered to be one of the most dramatic, severe, human-induced environmental catastrophes of all time, certainly in the United States. And it was extremely important, not only in the Great Plains, where it had such dramatic effects, turning a lot of quite valuable fertile land into scenes like this, but also for the effects that it had on government programs, government deployment to try to mitigate these kinds of damages, and it also had an international significance. It was seen as a cataclysm of such significance as to really get the attention of people worldwide, particularly people in positions of authority in colonial settings, in fact, where the U.S. government's response to the Dust Bowl was seen as a kind of example, possibly to be followed, in the larger worldwide effort to address a growing concern of soil erosion and agricultural productivity in places such as Africa, Latin America, Asia, that kind of thing. So the drama here had some lasting consequences not only in the Great Plains but elsewhere. Here's some prairie dogs doing what they do best, which is essentially to eat grass. They prefer that their habitat look like this, and that is principally because they're small, they're tasty. Pretty much everything out there that can eat them will eat them. That includes not only black-footed ferrets, but a wide variety of birds, raptors, owls, hawks, that sort of thing. Coyotes, foxes, they're like these little walking niblets. They're quite delicious, I guess. And so they're very paranoid about predators, and they don't like there to be any grass in their way, so that they can see very carefully what's coming and what might come eat them. There's been some very funny recent research. Some animal behavior and linguistic expert has developed evidence to suggest that prairie dogs actually have a language, and that the noises they make to each other are refer very specifically to different kinds of threats. And they have different calls to say coyote over there versus hawk up there. Who knows whether that's true? But they are very social animals. They tend to create and maintain these enormous colonies that can be many, many square miles in size, in which there's basically no grass because they have eaten it all down. And for this reason, along with the fact that their burrows can be dangerous for people on horseback, motivated the campaign to eradicate them, which just in some places continues to this day. The notion being that they are eating grass that properly belongs in the stomachs of livestock, and that their holes are dangerous and therefore they should be gotten rid of. So, with that little bizarre prelude, and we will come back to it. But let's ask about sustainability. What is it? The most famous, by far, definition of it comes from the World Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future, a publication from 1987, which is more frequently referred to as the Brundtland Report, after the last name of its lead author. And they came up with this. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You've probably seen this definition before. It's widely cited, and it came along shortly before the Rio Conference on Environment and Development, which really launched current notions and efforts of very widespread sort of focus on the idea that we need development, but that the development needs to be sustainable. And this is the definition that's usually used. What is it then? It seems it's essentially about perpetuation over time, which begs the question of how long. And if the answer is not necessarily forever, because that seems a little extreme, how long is long enough? The problem here is that ultimately it would seem that we can only recognize sustainability retrospectively, or after the fact. In other words, and this is a problem that plagues a lot of studies today, not only of development but even of ecology. This is essentially a tautologous argument. That which persists is sustainable. That which does not persist, which we won't find out until it's gone, is retrospectively, in a kind of post hoc way, unsustainable. Now, this creates a lot of difficulties because how are we supposed to look at something that's there now and determine if it's sustainable when we can't know yet, until the passage of time, whether it will in fact continue to persist? So what is it that is perpetuated? Might we be able to unpack this further and come up with a more specific notion of what it is that persists? We need to find a way to define the system in question, bound it, identify its characteristic features, and then talk about why it persists rather than just whether it persists. We can offer a variety of spatial definitions in an effort to bound it and define it. We can do that, and it frequently has been done in terms of botanical features, perhaps edaphic features, meaning soil characteristics, perhaps climatic features. These are ways of beginning to specify in geographical terms, the landscape, the system that we're talking about. And this is a way of going about this that has deep roots in ecology, and particularly in ecology as it has been deployed by the U.S. federal government since early in the 20th century. Ecologists took this up initially by means of the concept of the ecosystem, which has its roots around the turn of the 20th century. So, in the beginning of the 1900s, they first put together this concept and really started studying it by identifying and working within systems that were fairly easily defined, like lakes, sand dunes, and islands. So, in these cases, the boundaries, the geographical boundaries, were fairly obvious, and it was convenient or easy to think about them as systems, sort of operating in their own terms. This gets a lot more difficult, however, when you sort of have to scale it up and try to think about things larger than a lake or a dune or an island. Try to think about watersheds, regions or biomes, or even continents. What do we do with sustainability? How do we begin to map it or think about it at these larger scales? Here is a map of biomes of North America, the coniferous forest, the hardwood forest, the southeastern pine forest mixed, and then non-forested, which is kind of a default catch-all category for everything else. And you'll notice that those prairie dogs were quite nicely distributed within this. The map matches quite nicely for that big area of non-forested land in the middle of North America. The prairie dogs, you might point out, actually may have played a role in that. If you look at prairie dog activities in the Southwest, they don't just eat grass, they also eat little seedling trees and are very effective at preventing the establishment and growth of, say, mesquite trees in the Southwest. And in fact, their eradication from the Southwest, according to some people, may have had something to do with the loss of grasslands and conversion to mesquite shrublands. But that's another story we don't need to go into right now. Here is an effort to subdivide the Great Plains into subunits. Another major biological feature or factor in this is the bison. The bison also had a very similar range, also had a very acute impact on grasses, and in fact seem to have lived in a kind of synergistic or symbiotic relationship with prairie dogs, believe it or not. You'd think they would be competitors, but in fact, if you watch bison and prairie dogs in the same place, you will notice that the bison go out of their way to hang out where the prairie dogs are and eat the green grass that grows up after the prairie dogs have harvested off the top. The grass in a prairie dog colony, it's been found, is actually more nutritious than the grass away from the prairie dog colony, and the bison have figured this out. Worcester, in introducing his treatment of the Great Plains, and particularly the southern Great Plains where the Dust Bowl was worst, relies on a variety of processes to define the Great Plains and explain how it came to have the various ecological features that it had. So these include geological processes, such as the Laramide Revolution, which is, anybody remember? The Laramides, when they rose up and overthrew the government? Just kidding. Sorry. No, the Laramide Revolution, it was what brought the Rocky Mountains into being. It is the creation of the Rocky Mountains, which had revolutionary implications for the climate of North America, among other things. There are climatic processes involved, ice ages, the retreat and advance of glaciers over time. They reach down into the Great Plains, had an effect on these things. Atmospheric pressure systems, here he's referring principally to the effect of the Rocky Mountains on the climate of the Great Plains. They cast a rain shadow, which means that it's drier there than it would otherwise be. Hydrological processes, the water cycle and sedimentation, basically the soils of the Great Plains are the result of the erosion of the Rocky Mountains and the movement of that sediment eastward across the plains. Mineralogical processes of soil formation and chemical interactions. Phenological processes, the growth, dispersal, and reproduction of organisms, particularly plants. All of these things Worcester touches on in his attempts to sort of set the scene, to contextualize this part of North America and its important features. And the thing I would point out is that these processes span a wide range of temporal scales, from hundreds of millions of years in the case of the Laramide Revolution, down to what happens in the course of a single growing season as far as, say, grasses. We can also look at human processes that affected this ongoing development of the Great Plains. Hunting, grazing, fire, and agriculture are obviously important parts of this. The role of Native Americans in hunting bison and burning grass are important. Natural fires that start help to preserve the grass by burning off seedlings of trees, much like prairie dogs can do. There are evolutionary processes, natural selection among organisms. For Worcester, a big question that needs to be answered is, why are the Great Plains dominated by grasses? And there are a variety of explanations for this. The limited moisture due to that rain shower, recurrent droughts, which are an important disturbance affecting the persistence of grasses and other organisms, shallow soils, fire, and herbivory, which is to say stuff-eating plants. And when we talk about herbivory, the principal example that Worcester's thinking of is bison, but we could also include prairie dogs. We could even include termites and insects that also eat grasses. All of these things can be adduced as partial explanations for the dominance of grasses in the Great Plains. So how do we understand the multiple processes interacting with each other over time, occurring at various spatial and temporal scales, to produce the outcomes that we see on the ground? For example, in the case of just thinking about this as an ecological system, we need to think about predation, the relationship of, say, bison to wolves. Wolves have, or did have, an effect on the behavior of bison. The bison were more likely to bunch up into a herd and graze as a herd and move as a herd, the effect there being that they would very severely impact one portion of the range, beat those grasses down, trample them a lot, eat them a lot, and then in order to maintain this herd, which would be better suited to defend against wolves. In the absence of wolves, there's less incentive for them to bunch together. That's another story. We can also think about prairie dogs and ferrets in the same relationship. We can think about competition between bison and other grazing animals, such as pronghorn. We can think about parasitism. Who knows what a cowbird is? Yes, what's a cowbird? Very good. A cowbird is a species that evolved with the bison. It moved with the bison. It didn't build nests because it couldn't stay in one place long enough to use them, because it was following the bison. As a result, it learned or developed the adaptation that it lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, and its eggs, typically its chicks, when they hatch, are bigger than the native songbirds' nests, or birds in those nests, and they outcompete those native birds, those other birds, I shouldn't say native because the cowbird is native as well, and have an effect on other species of birds in this fashion. They're parasitical on other songbirds. They're symbiotic with the bison, essentially by eating parasites on the bison. They ride around on their back sometimes, that sort of thing. Symbiotic relationships, as I just mentioned, the cowbirds and the bison, all of these are ecological ways of thinking about some of the processes involved in sustaining these systems. And here we're only looking at ecology. So just a little background in case all you've ever done is fly over the Great Plains, the way most people do. And when you look down, it might look pretty similar from start to finish, but in fact, it's quite different. In the drier western parts of it, it tends to look much more like this, which is to say short grass prairie. By the time you get further east into areas of more rainfall, the grasses are still dominant, but they are much, much taller. You get tall grass prairie. In between is what's known as, of course, midgrass prairie. One of the most important ecologists of the 20th century, a man named Frederick Clemens, did his dissertation work in Nebraska, right, sort of in the middle of the Great Plains, where he helped create the whole discipline of ecology by figuring out ways to measure the vegetation in what otherwise looks like just sort of endless homogeneous scenery. And he noticed that he noticed this variation and the movement of midgrass east and west depending on rainfall. If you got higher rainfall, the taller grasses did better and grew up, and an area such as Nebraska would resemble tall grass prairie. During a drought, on the other hand, the taller grasses would not do as well. The shorter grasses would dominate, and you would get midgrass or shortgrass prairie. And he was able, studying vegetation in plots, 1 meter square plots, and watching the changing composition with rainfall, he was able to sort of substitute space for time and think about the way in which, in other words, he could move across these long transects of vegetation and recognize changes in composition, and then he could flip that into a temporal sequence based on rainfall rather than just a spatial sequence at any one moment in time. This was an important step forward in systematizing ecology. It allowed him to start formalizing the idea of a vegetation community, the idea that certain species of plants would be found together in what he called a community or an association of vegetation, which in turn allowed ecologists to think in quantitative terms, because he'd done all these measurements, about the dynamics of vegetation over time. So they were temporally dynamic, moving east and west in response to rainfall. He also observed a dynamic of disturbance and recovery in response to grazing and fire and also plowing. Part of what motivated his efforts was the fact that he was sitting in the middle of the process that Worcester describes, the process of rapid, aggressive plowing of the prairie and conversion to farming. And as he proceeded through his years at the University of Nebraska, he found it more and more difficult to find prairie at all because it was being plowed up so extensively and so rapidly. But he was able to, nonetheless, develop this framework for thinking about vegetation communities and their spatial distribution and their temporal dynamics. So he managed to put together the idea that they're organized into communities. He also suggested that these communities evolve through identifiable stages. And he defined both a primary succession, which was, as he put it, almost geological in its time scale. In other words, he discussed the ways in which first you get lichens and mosses and very small vegetation forming on rock or very thin soils. Those plants die and decay and help to create soil, which changes the conditions under which plants can grow and enables other taller kinds of grasses to grow. This process carried out on geological timescales produced the 6 or 7 feet of incredibly rich topsoil found in the Midwest and literally brought into being conditions for tall grass prairie. He then went on to suggest that this would be recapitulated in what he called secondary succession at more human timescales. In other words, if you disturbed a site by grazing it too hard or plowing it, or if it burned, it would go through a similar series of steps as it recovered. You would get invasion first by annual plants that would rapidly colonize a site and stabilize the soil, and over time create the conditions in which perennial grasses would evolve. He even suggested that in the absence of fire, eventually the Great Plains would be covered with trees, which would be the final stage. This theory of vegetation dynamics, of succession through stages towards what he called climax conditions, is extremely important in the history of ecology. It still prevails in a lot of fields, or at least is used in a lot of parts of the world to understand vegetation dynamics, and it also has important theoretical implications for how people think about nature in general, specifically in its confidence that recovery will always occur if you simply remove the disturbing agent. So how can we ourselves begin to use all of this to put together another way of thinking about sustainability? Some of the processes, the key processes in any system, are going to involve absorbing inputs, either through decomposition, through herbivory, through the cycling of nutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, but also carbon, water. These might also be counted among the list of key processes. And the production of outputs. Primary production, which is plant growth. Secondary production, which is everything that eats those plants, directly or indirectly. And others as well on longer time scales, perhaps, if we want to think about the growth of forests or even sort of longer-term evolution of other kinds of outputs. You might even think about effects on regional climate. These have to somehow together reproduce themselves over time. This would be the persistence part, right? In order for it to continue through time and demonstrate its sustainability. All of this carrying out through structures, which I would loosely define as relatively enduring physical patterns in the landscape. And here we can think at small scales of soil pores and layers, sort of how does the water get down through the soil. We can think about sod, which is key in Worcester's story, the root mass created by prairie vegetation, which is what the sod busters had to plow through and somehow open up in order to plant their crops. And in some cases, the sod was so thick and so strong that this was by no means an easy task. Structures obviously also can include topography,